I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to start taking a look at the civil rights movement. Some of the key objectives we'll take a look at today will be the efforts to end segregation in the 1940s and 50s and see how there was just not enough support quite yet, especially in the 1940s. We'll explain the importance of the landmark decision of the case of Brown versus the Board of Ed. We'll look at the controversy over school desegregation in many different places, including in Little Rock, Arkansas. And we'll discuss the Montgomery bus boycott and its impact. Now, in an effort to give you a little more frame of reference, something that we've studied for in the past, I just want to go through a little bit with the separate but equal case. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that racially segregated public schools were legal, meaning they were constitutional and okay. So in many ways, the Supreme Court gave the thumbs up to segregation. So long as the facilities for African Americans and whites were equal. So they said they had to be equal, but in reality, we know that the facilities were very rarely equal. The ruling constitutionally sanctioned laws barring African Americans from sharing the same buses, schools, and other public facilities as whites. These laws were already nicknamed and imposed in the South, the Jim Crow laws. These laws were then deemed to be constitutional. So they were already implemented in the South and throughout a good portion of the country, but until the Supreme Court in 1896 ruled on this particular set of rules, and there was some skepticism as to whether or not they were constitutionally legal, and the Supreme Court said okay. So this established the separate but equal doctrine that would stand for the next 6 decades. So when you even think about the Civil War is fought in the 1860s. It's not until the 1960s, 100 years later, that we finally start moving forward in some degree of equality, at least on paper. By the early 1950s, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was working hard to challenge segregation laws in public schools. They had filed lawsuits on the behalf of plaintiffs in states such as South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. In that case, that would become the most famous plaintiff, named Oliver Brown. He filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of his daughter, Linda Brown, against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. In 1951, after his daughter Linda was denied entrance into Topeka's all-white elementary school. In the lawsuit, Brown claimed that schools for black children were not equal to white schools, and that segregation violated the so-called Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which holds that no state can deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This case went between the United States District Court in Kansas, which agreed that public school segregation had a detrimental effect upon colored children and contributed to a sense of feeling inferior, but still upheld the separate but equal doctrine. So basically, Kansas said, we hear what you're saying, you have some points, but we're not going to rule in your favor. So as we move forward throughout this lesson, eventually we're going to come back to this Brown case and see how ultimately the Supreme Court will have to take this up in the near future. Okay, so let's take a look here. The foundation case that we had mentioned before, how did the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision impact segregation? It declared de jure segregation of the races in the South constitutional. De jure means by law. So if you passed a law segregating and separating facilities, but you say that they're equal, then it was okay. And as we mentioned, the Jim Crow laws are the name of the laws that were passed in the South that kept African Americans and whites separate. 2, why were separate but equal facilities rarely equal? Well, public facilities and schools for African Americans were often not as good. They were the older facilities. Sometimes they would have an old school. They would move African Americans in, build a new one for whites. Therefore, there was very rarely a situation where whites and African American facilities were equal. Another type of segregation is de facto segregation. This took place very often in the North. This had a severe impact on people of color. African Americans in the North faced job discrimination. They often could not get high-paying jobs or kind of stuck in the cycle of low-paying jobs. They also faced discrimination in housing, denied housing in many neighborhoods, and forced to live in poor areas. So the difference between de jure and de facto segregation is through like over the course of time through customs or traditions or just settlement patterns, refusing to sell homes, let's say, to African Americans, and they get kind of forced through de facto or default segregation. They can get kind of stuck in some of these more rundown neighborhoods in areas where they can only walk to if they didn't have a car, obviously, to some of the lower paying jobs, let's say in factories. So this is kind of an ongoing cycle during the 20th century, and certainly during the first half of the 20th century, that through de facto segregation, African Americans ended up being separate. Four, besides African Americans, what other groups face de facto segregation? Asian Americans out west, Mexican Americans in the Southwest. Five, what events in the 1940s helped set the stage for the civil rights movement? African American veterans, when they returned home from World War II, they were frustrated at all the discrimination they still faced back at home. They felt like they had put their lives on the line for the country and done an admirable job, and they deserved more equalities within society. Secondly, nonviolent protests began. So the background of that is they're thinking about equality, they're thinking about why are they not equal, and they begin to protest in a nonviolent fashion. President Truman, we had mentioned this previously when we looked at Truman's administration. Through executive order, Truman desegregated the military and tried to encourage integration in other areas as well. Unfortunately for Truman, the Democrats who had implemented Jim Crow and the Democrats who controlled much of the Congress at that point in time were in favor of segregation, and as a result, Democrats basically held back and pushed against any integration or rights of delivering equal rights to African Americans. Okay, number 6, who founded CORE and what did it do? James Farmer in 1942. It's the Congress of Racial Equality, attempted to end segregation. They try to bring attention to their cause through nonviolent protests, sit-ins, and later on they would be freedom riders. They would ride aboard buses, attempting to integrate the buses throughout the South. A little button there too, the Freedom Ride Corps. Who were 3 advocates of nonviolent protest? When you think historically speaking, Henry David Thoreau, Mohandas Gandhi, and Martin Luther King, pictured here. Thoreau, Gandhi, King. So in many ways, Martin Luther King was a disciple of Gandhi, and Gandhi a disciple of Thoreau. 1947 was a monumentous year, very important year for African Americans. Jackie Robinson became the first African American to play professional baseball. Once again, it's tough to think about it, but it was only 73 years ago, not that long ago that African Americans could not play Major League Baseball, and they're obviously segregated in many other areas throughout history. So certainly the idea of African Americans playing baseball, there's some of the best players in the history of baseball have been African Americans, but it's sad that only during the past 75 years or so or less, the African Americans have actually had that right. So there's Jackie Robinson, 42. His number is retired in professional baseball to honor his sacrifice. And by sacrifice, we mean that when he played Major League Baseball, he faced a lot of prejudice, players on his own team, a lot of racial slurs when he played ball. He got hit by a lot of pitches. When he played second base, he would be covering the base on a steal, and people would slide with their metal cleats into his ankle and his leg. 9, what is the NAACP? Formed in 1909 to fight for the rights of African Americans, stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And what they did is they used legal efforts to try and bring about change. This included lawsuits, congressional bills or laws, and explain what methods the NAACP used to gain rights for African Americans. I jumped the gun there a little bit. Were these methods successful? Well, they employed lawyers or attorneys. So they had a staff of attorneys who worked on some of these different things to bring about lawsuits. So through the courts, they lobbied Congress to pass new laws to promote equality. Unfortunately, Southern members of Congress blocked civil rights bills. So when you think about the way they did facilitate change, it was especially true through Supreme Court decisions. 11, who served as the NAACP's chief counsel and director of legal defense from 1939 to 1961. Thurgood Marshall. Later on, he would become the very first African American Supreme Court justice in 1967. Surprisingly enough, there's only been 2 African American Supreme Court justices in the history of our country, second being Clarence Thomas, appointed in the 1980s. 12, Woodham Marshall, focusing on, after World War II, ending segregation in public schools, which will take us into the Brown versus Board of Ed case. Here's a little more background on the Brown case. In Brown's case, Linda Brown, a young girl who was attempting to go to an integrated school. When Brown's case and 4 other cases related to school segregation first came before the Supreme Court in 1952, the court combined them into one single case under the name Brown versus the Board of Ed. So they're trying to, one of the purposes of the Supreme Court is to render decisions to kind of clean up discrepancies throughout the other states. So they took together all the different lawsuits that had a very similar point, which is that schools should be desegregated and they were inherently unfair. Thurgood Marshall from the NAACP was the chief attorney for Linda Brown and the Brown family as the plaintiffs. At first, the justices were divided on how to rule on school segregation, with Chief Justice Fred Vinson holding the opinion that Plessy verdict should stand. In September 1953, before Brown versus the Board of Ed was to be heard, Vinson died. President Eisenhower replaced him with Earl Warren, who was then the governor of California. Displaying considerable political skill and determination, the new Chief Justice succeeded in engineering a unanimous verdict against school segregation the following year. So when you think about Earl Warren, kind of an underrated person in history, the Warren Court would pass several significant Supreme Court decisions that will protect the rights of citizens. We'll be looking at those as we move forward. Just to give you a quick preview, the right to remain silent, your Miranda rights, which are now read to suspected criminals who are being arrested. That was mandated. Your right to an attorney, that's guaranteed through the Warren Court. So there are several key decisions that kind of protect individual rights and freedoms that come out of the Warren Court. In the decision issued on May 17, 1954, Warren wrote that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently by nature unequal. As a result, the court ruled that the plaintiffs were being deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. So that was the ruling here, and just kind of look at the background here so you have some notes on it. On behalf of Linda Brown, the NAACP had filed the lawsuit against the Topeka Board of Ed, saying that it was unconstitutional. 15, as we mentioned, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional per the 14th Amendment. And then the quote that we mentioned there by Earl Warren, who you see pictured, that separate but equal has no place within society. 16, what impact did the Brown decision have on African Americans? They believe that the ruling should apply to all facilities. So they wanted to take it one step further, and they wanted to challenge segregation everywhere. 17, how did white Southerners react? Obviously, they're going to be outraged, determined to defend segregation. 18, why was the Supreme Court wording the Brown decision of how quickly schools needed to desegregate problematic? Well, what they said is with all deliberate speed, schools should be desegregated. So I'll give you a moment to think. What is the definitive timeline of all deliberate speed? If you said there is no definitive timeline, then you would be correct. So they didn't give you a specific timeline there, which gave a loophole to a lot of the schools to interpret deliberate speed with their own interpretation. Deliberate speed for some school districts might be 1 month, another 1 year, another could be a decade, and some might say indefinitely they will suspend that idea. They're going to do it as quickly as possible, but nowhere in the near future. So no specific timetable. So many districts did indeed take years to desegregate. '19, what was the Southern Manifesto? 100 Southern members of Congress wrote and signed and denounced the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus the Board of Ed, saying this was a clear abuse of judicial power. They pledged to use all lawful means to reverse the decision. Although it had no legal stand-in, the defiant act by members of Congress encouraged white Southerners to continue to defy the Brown ruling, which they did well into the 1960s. 20, as you can surmise, the KKK was outraged as well. They organized the White Citizens Council that imposed economic and political pressure against anyone who complied with the Brown versus Board of Ed ruling. Now we'll see a series of challenges as we move into different areas of the South in regard to desegregating public education. 21, how did President Eisenhower feel about the Brown versus the Board of Ed decision? Why did he decide to send federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas? Eisenhower did not necessarily agree with the Brown decision and actually expressed some doubt in private. However, he felt that it was necessary to send troops in to Little Rock, Arkansas to uphold the law. He believed it was unacceptable for certain groups to disobey the court decision and federal law. 22, how did Eisenhower attempt to persuade people to stop their actions towards African Americans in his address on Little Rock? Well, first thing you need to know, and we'll slide down a little bit here, is that when the ruling was set down that schools should be desegregated, you can see here in these two photographs, African American students, 9 attempted to attend Little Rock, Arkansas High School. The governor of Arkansas refused to uphold the Brown versus Board of Ed decision and wanted to deny their entrance to Little Rock, Arkansas High School. So Eisenhower appealed to national respect for the law. He reminded Arkansas and Little Rock specifically, and the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, that they need to follow the law. He appealed to their better nature and respect for the country and the law. The Arkansas governor, as we look at 23, he ordered the National Guard to go to Little Rock, Arkansas High School, not to protect the 9 children, but to, and I bolded it, basically guard the high school from allowing the 9 African American school children to enter Little Rock, Arkansas High School, Central High School in Little Rock. Faubus saw this as a preservation of states' rights. He believed it was his right as the governor of Arkansas to do what he saw fit in regard to not desegregating Little Rock High School. President Eisenhower, he countered and sent in federal troops to escort the children to class. So basically we had a stand down where, and we're going to see this with many governors in many southern states, they're going to lean on the side of upholding Plessy versus Ferguson versus that of Brown versus the Board of Ed. Remember, when Brown versus the Board of Ed was decided, that basically null and voided Plessy versus Ferguson, which no longer had any legal standing in the country. Next, we're going to go to Montgomery, Alabama, and deal with the situation I'm sure you're familiar with. Rosa Parks, she was an African-American seamstress, as we look at 24, from Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a public bus. There's a quote. "The only tired I was tired of giving in," Rosa Parks, in the 1950s. What do Montgomery laws state about travel on public buses? Seats in the front of the bus are reserved for whites, seats in the back for African Americans, middle seats are available to anyone. However, in the event that the bus filled up, African Americans in the middle had to give up their seats to whites, which of course Parks refused to do. 26, how did the actions of Parks and the court challenge impact Montgomery? It led African Americans to boycotting the entire Montgomery bus system. Martin Luther King made a speech that inspired protests throughout the nation that lasted over a year. Many consider the Montgomery bus boycotts the start of the modern civil rights movement. 27, how did King harness the power of African American churches in the community there? Well, Dr. King was a Baptist minister. His speeches, his sermons were often inspirational, often referencing religion and inspiring his congregation to protest. King formed the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which organized other Baptist ministers throughout the South to lead nonviolent protests, such as the Prayer Pilgrimage in 1957. And he helped through the religious communities to coordinate a support system so that people could continue to support the bus boycott. So, for example, if you're going to boycott the buses, well, you still need to get from place to place. You need to get to work. You maybe have to go grocery shopping. Maybe you need to get to church. So what he did is he organized carpools, encouraged those who could walk to work to do so. He advocated avoiding violence, and he encouraged patience as Park's lawsuit took many months to work its way through the courts. So you can see some of the imagery there, including the bottom right corner of Parks' arrest photo. You see the bus, bottom center, people walking and protesting in the bottom left and the middle left. You see the Parks photograph in the middle top and another picture of the bus there on the right. So we look at the lesson reflection. How did the Montgomery bus boycotts provide the foundation for the civil rights movement? It showed that through organization, coordination, nonviolent protest, and a determination of the African American community, people could unite together and facilitate and bring about change, which was a key component moving forward in the civil rights movement. Hopefully you enjoyed some of our initial discussions here on the civil rights movement. There's a tremendous amount yet to come as we continue to moving forward in regards to the civil rights movement. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.